Joseph Abbeel's memoir offers a riveting glimpse into the life of a Flemish horseman conscripted into Napoleon's Grand Army. This is the 10th episode. We find Abbeel on the long road home. Let's begin. The next day we took the main road to Minsk, a city about 80 hours walk from Vitebsk, located on a hill at the edge of a large forest. The day before we arrived in Minsk, we drove until late evening, thinking we could reach the city. However, darkness eventually caught up with us and we stayed an hour away from the city at a deserted post house for the night. There, we met several Frenchmen, but none of them could start a fire. In the darkness, I entered the house to see if there was anything to be found. By touch, I embraced a person who still felt warm but was already deceased. I dropped him and walked back to my comrades in the courtyard. I asked an infantryman if he knew any way to make fire. He responded negatively, stating he had powder and a gun, but couldn't use them to start a fire. I then tore a piece off my shirt and placed it in the pan of his gun, sprinkled some gunpowder on it, and thus we got the cloth burning. I then asked for a cartridge, a paper casing with powder, which I poured over a bundle of straw. I placed the burning cloth next to it, but the powder, probably being wet, did not ignite. Therefore, I told the infantryman, who was a conscript, to blow on it. After much blowing, the powder and straw caught fire, but the poor fool was blackened with soot, his hair and sideburns singed. I had a good laugh at him. We dismantled the wooden stalls and made a very good fire. With a handful of burning straw, I went back inside the house and found the dead body that had more than 50 pitchfork stabs and was still warm. We kept watch all night, as we were in great danger. When we left the next morning, we first set the post house on fire. We reached Minsk and stayed there overnight. The next day, we went to the meadow where we had left our horses upon arrival, as there was no hay to be found in the city for them. When we arrived at the meadow, we discovered that all the horses had been stolen, so we had to continue our journey on foot. We traveled together towards Vilnius, which was about 60 hours walk away. One day, we arrived in a village where we found food supplies and paused to make soup. The others went raiding while I stayed as the cook by the fire. While sitting there, I began to treat my wounded hand, as it had been several days since I had last looked at it. I could feel that my hand was not healing. In a shard of a broken pot, I heated some water to loosen the bandage, which was all bloodied, dried, and hardened. After unwrapping the bandage from my hand, I discovered that there were over 2,000 maggots in each wound, especially between the fingers. Undaunted, I cleaned the wounds with salt and water and re-wrapped the cloth. I then took a straw and poked around in the wounds until I got all the maggots out. I didn't tell my comrades about this incident. When the soup was ready, I served it from the pot. In the meantime, my raiders had returned with various food items they had loaded onto a cart, which was pulled by 2 horses they had forcibly taken from 5 or 6 infantrymen who were also raiding. After we had eaten the soup, we set off. Half of us jumped onto the cart while the other half, including myself, followed on foot. As we walked, talking and laughing, Ladrisson, who was driving the horses, looked back and immediately accused me of having cheated them, alleging that I had probably bought a bottle of red schnapps in Minsk, which had surely broken in my pocket, as my white linen trousers were covered in red spots. I looked at my trousers and saw that they were indeed stained red from the blood that had seeped from my hand. I had been carrying the hand wrapped in a large cloth around my neck. My face immediately changed color. Yes, I turned blue, white, pale, and purple, as they later told me. I called for help, thinking my final hour had come. They all ran to me. When we unwrapped the bandage, blood spurted at least a foot high from a vein between the fingers, which I had probably hit while removing the maggots. The blood gushed out like a fountain. Everyone took their neck or pocket handkerchiefs and wrapped them tightly around my hand. When the bleeding stopped, my hand felt so heavy, as if it weighed 400 pounds. This incident occurred just as we were driving into a large forest. I asked my comrades to continue and leave me behind to die there. However, they would not do so on the wagon. Against my will, they laid me down and tied me to it. Because I tried to jump off violently to await death in the underbrush. We drove on until evening fell and found a barn where we spent the night. 4 of them took me off the wagon, laid me in the stable, and covered me. They made a fire and cooked soup. I pretended to sleep but often heard them say that I would soon be dead. The next morning, I awoke first and felt significantly better, but to our misfortune, our wagon and horses had been stolen during the night. We set off on foot towards Vilnius, where we arrived after several days' march. Upon our arrival there, I fell ill. We stayed in a deserted house outside the city. My comrades left me when they noticed that the enemy was getting closer to the city each day. Only my bunkmate of the past 4 years and Ladrisson stayed with me. After lying on the straw for 5 days, I got better. One night, when I went outside to relieve myself, I stepped on a dead body lying against the door. In the darkness, I felt the body and realized it was a woman's. I walked back inside the house, we lit a light, went back to look, and indeed found the body. We grabbed it by the legs and dragged it a few steps away. As I was now able to travel, we decided to leave the next day. But unfortunately, that day my bunkmate Van Abbeel fell ill. We stayed with him, but on the third night of his illness, the enemy arrived and began shelling the city. When the civilians noticed this, they repossessed their homes, which were full of sick, wounded, and frozen soldiers. They threw the unfortunate ones out the windows onto the cobblestones. Seeing this, we became frightened and, with tears in our eyes, left our comrade behind, as it was time to leave the city. What became of him or where he ended up, I do not know. Outside the city, we saw that everyone was fleeing. They all took the road to Kaunas, a city on the Niemen, about 30 hours walk from Vilnius and the last city of Russian Poland. About 2.5 hours from Vilnius, at the foot of a very high and steep mountain, we encountered the Imperial Guard. Because the horses were unable to pull the wagons with their valuable cargo up the icy slope, soldiers of the guard broke open the treasure chests and looted them. It was quite a sight to see them all wanting gold coins or Napoleons. They threw whole bags of silver 5-franc pieces on the ground, as if they had no value, to find the gold coins underneath. Unfortunately, it was so cold that we dared not take our hands out from under our armpits to pick up a few coins. When the Cossacks noticed this scene, they quickly rode up. They killed a large number of the plunderers or took them prisoner. Only a few of them survived their captivity, as the Cossacks led them to Vilnius and incarcerated them in large groups in prison, where they starved or were poisoned. We passed a small part of our army, which was on this side of the mountain, and reached a small town 7 hours walk from Kaunas. There, Ladrisson fell ill. Not knowing what to do, I went to a Jew and made a deal with him that he would bring us, for payment of 2 louis d'ors, by sled to Kaunas. Because the Jew was afraid that someone on the main road would take his horse, he took a back road through the forests and over terribly high mountains. By evening, we arrived in Kaunas. Here, I had the Jew stop in front of a hospital. I asked him to wait until I had inquired inside for a place for my sick comrade. In the hospital, I found only a few soldiers who had been left behind and rooms full of corpses. I went back outside with the intention of finding a house with the Jew where my unfortunate compatriot and I could stay overnight. When I left the hospital, I saw Ladrisson lying in the middle of the cobblestone road. The Jew had thrown him off the sled and had run off. I helped Ladrisson up and walked with him through the city for a long time until we were allowed into the house of another Jew, for payment of a louis d'or, where we could sleep on the straw. The next day I learned that the enemy was at the city gates. I did not know what to do with my sick friend, so I took him back to the hospital and left him there, with tears in my eyes. What became of him, I do not know. Together with a few wounded infantrymen, I crossed the bridge over the Niemen. Once on the other side, we were in Prussian Poland. For several days, we traveled day and night. Upon our arrival in Wilkowy skis, I heard that there was a good hospital there. Realizing I could not walk much further, as my 2 feet were completely frozen, I decided to stay there. There was also a rumor that the Prussian troops had joined the French to prevent the enemy from crossing the Niemen. We gladly believed this, as we thought they would prefer to fight rather than let their country be devastated by the enemy. The region from Kaunas to here had remained untouched so far. Every 8 to 10 hours, there was a staging post where a commissioner resided who was tasked with distributing billeting tickets, but these scoundrels only came out of their houses when they saw 300 to 400 men sitting or lying in front of their door waiting. Some soldiers were foolish enough to wait 6 to 7 hours in front of those scoundrels' doors instead of moving on. When we arrived at such places at 11 or 12 o'clock at night, there were often already hundreds of wretches, more dead than alive, waiting for Mr. the murderer of so many wounded, to come out. When he finally appeared, he lined us up in rows, counted 20 or 30 men, and gave them a ticket to go to some village to lodge. These villages were often 2 to 3 hours walk away from our route. Without providing us with a guide or showing us the way, he sent us off, and then Mr. returned to his house. In this way, we often stumbled through the night, sometimes finding lodgings and sometimes not. Since I cannot describe how and in what ways we were plagued and tormented by everyone, both by the French commissioners and the local population, I will resign myself to the thought that it was a public punishment. And with these remarks, we will return to Wilkowiskis. When I arrived at the hospital there, I was shown a bed at the entrance of a large hall. On the second day I was there, it was very cold and I had pulled the blanket over my head to wait for soup in this way. While I lay in my bed, someone entered the hall asking for the head nurse. I heard him answer that he would wait. This person stood next to my bed to take a look through the window overlooking the courtyard. Curious to see if it was not a soldier from our regiment, I threw back the blanket. I looked at the man wearing the uniform of a lancer, but I did not recognize him. Yet I spoke to him. "Lancer, it seems quite cold." He affirmed, "This morning I nearly froze while escorting the emperor." From his accent, I heard that he was from Flanders, so I asked him from which place he came. He told me he was from Oudenaarde, and he asked me if I knew the town. "Yes," I said, and I told him that I had lived in the school of Costa more than 16 years ago and that I was born in the region around Antwerp. He looked at me and I looked at him, and eventually I said that he was the son of Mr. Riepsaye. "Yes," he said, "and you are Abbeel." Our joy was great and we talked at length until the head nurse came in and immediately led Riepsaye to another room. That day we could not see each other again, as I could only leave my bed with great difficulty and he was even worse off. The next morning at dawn, I heard the nurses quietly say to each other that sleds would come to transport the sick, as it would not be long before the Cossacks would arrive. I got up, found Riepsaye, told him the news, and urged him to be vigilant, for I had heard that the sleds could only transport half of all the sick. Indeed, there was only room for half of the sick and wounded in the sleds. I kept watch until the sleds arrived and immediately took my place in one. With joy, however, I saw that my compatriot had also managed to secure a place. As we departed, we saw that the civilians were running to plunder the hospital. We arrived at the hospital in Gumbinnen around midnight. Since I was one of the last to arrive, I only found space in the bed of a Saxon soldier who had dysentery. As he was too sick to be transported, he was the only one left in the hospital. Everyone else had fled, except for 2 or 3 German nurses and the director. I lay down next to the Saxon soldier, but as I was very hungry, I got up and walked from one room to another until I finally met one of the caregivers. I asked him for food, but he answered me very rudely that I could go to Moscow to get it. We argued for a while, but there was simply no food to be had. I returned and lay down next to my half-dead sleeping companion. The next day, I went looking for my old schoolmate and countryman and finally found him while he lay on the blue stone floor. Then I walked in and out of one room after another until I finally met the mentioned caregiver again. We exchanged words again and even started fighting, each with a crutch. Eventually, I received such a blow on my wounded arm that I nearly fainted. Although I was not only asking for food for myself but for everyone lying there, no one came to my aid. The director, who had heard the commotion, came into the hall and led the caregiver to a pen. Meanwhile, I hid. When everything was quiet, I went out again and finally found 2 empty beds. I fetched Riepsaye and carried him to one of the beds. We thought we could stay there together for a while, but coincidentally a carabinier from our regiment came by, who told us that the Cossacks would soon arrive. Immediately, everyone who was able to leave received the order to flee. "What now?" I asked Riepsaye. He replied that I should leave and that I might manage to stay out of the hands of the Cossacks. Thereupon, I left with the carabinier and, with tears in my eyes, left Riepsaye behind in Gumbinnen. Gumbinnen is about 40 hours' walk from Königsberg. For 4 days and nights, the 2 of us walked on to escape the enemy, who was constantly on our heels. But with 4 open wounds, frozen feet, and almost no food, it was impossible to get far. On the 5th day, I fell ill in the evening and wanted to lie down in the middle of the main road, far from villages and cities, for I could go no further. I begged my regimental comrade to continue his journey alone. This vigilant brother in arms, however, saw a dilapidated barn or house, which stood about 100 rods, a little less than 400 meters, from the road. He forcibly picked me up, carried me inside, and laid me on a handful of straw on the floor, next to an unfortunate Pole who was lying there completely alone, dying, and soon gave up the ghost. Warthia, that was the name of the carabinier, from Dinon near Namur, left me there weeping, probably thinking that the same fate awaited him soon, as he was almost as badly off as I was. Here, completely alone in this house, I thought only of death and hoped that I would die immediately, for I expected at any moment the bearded men who would kill me with their lances. Moreover, what hope could I still harbor? I lacked everything that the earth gives or can give for the sustenance of man. And I was abandoned by everyone. There was nothing left for me but to commend myself to the providence of the Almighty, and to await my fate. Around midnight, I heard loud noises of men and horses around the house and could only think that they were enemies. But when they entered the house, I saw immediately that they were Saxon refugees. They had a sled, drawn by 3 horses, and they had more than 40,000 francs with them, as well as plentiful food supplies. They made a fire, brewed coffee, and cooked eggs and other foods. Yes, they ate and feasted without even asking me, "Dog or beast, are you not hungry?" I heard them say among other things that they would leave at 2 o'clock for Königsberg. I asked them to take me along, but they did not want to do so. They then went to sleep for a while. After they had woken up, they brewed coffee again. Meanwhile, I kept begging them to take me along. When they heard that I was a Fleming, they said they would take me along on the condition that I give them a louis d'or. I agreed to this and paid. We drove very fast all day until we arrived in a village around 10 o'clock in the evening, where we stayed overnight. Again, they prepared various dishes without offering me anything. The next day, the 3 of us left with the sled, which held all their money. The other 4 went on foot along back roads to Königsberg. In a suburb of Königsberg, we were to wait for them. They let the horses run as fast as they could, so that we arrived in the suburb by noon, where they let me get out. They gestured that they would wait there for their comrades. Dizzy and trembling, I walked into the city, where I received a lodging ticket in the evening. The next day, on Christmas Day, I went to hospital number 4, which was outside the Berlin gate. There, I lay a day and a night on the floor next to a bed, waiting until the person who was in the bed would die, to then take his place. Next to each bed, someone lay waiting for the death of his dying comrade. We did this without realizing that the same awaited us. I think it is not necessary to paint a picture for the reader of the moaning, groaning, and complaining that were heard there when the surgeons made their rounds in the morning. I will only tell you that their smallest operations consisted of amputating feet, legs, arms, and hands. In 9 days, I saw the entire hall, which housed about 300 beds with sick and wounded, die out 3 times, with each time not more than 10 to 12 men remaining. After a stay of 5 or 6 days in this hospital, I felt much better and was able to walk again. Because I had heard that some had obtained food supplies for 20 or 30 men from the war commissioner, on presentation of false coupons, I got up and went to an inn. There, I also made several coupons, which I took to the commissioner, who signed them. Afterward, I went to the warehouses to exchange the coupons for rations. On the way, I met the 4 Saxons who had come to the city on foot. They recognized me and asked if I had seen their comrades with the sled. I replied negatively. They began to curse and said that they had been stopped and were not allowed to travel further. One of them said, "Of those 2 scoundrels who took you along, one was my own brother. They have probably run off with our money." To myself, I said that they had gotten there just deserts, and with that thought, I left them. The food supplies that I had received, I sold in the city for a fair price. And with a tidy sum, I returned to the hospital. The next day, I joined a quartermaster, a sergeant, and a cuirassier from the 5th Regiment, who, as I knew, also engaged in this trade. For 4 days, we went in turn, with our self-made coupons, to the commissioner. Our trade was prosperous, and we made pure profit. But on January 3rd, we learned that the enemy was at the gates of the city and was preparing to enter the city. Everyone who could still walk jumped out of bed and fled. I and the aforementioned sergeant took the road to Königsberg. As we left Königsberg, we saw that they were throwing cannons into the river and burning baggage wagons everywhere. After 2 days of travel, I contracted dysentery. When the sergeant noticed this, he quietly left me behind. Nevertheless, I continued, all alone, until I reached Elbing on the 6th day. There, I found some armed troops again and obtained lodging with 12 other soldiers. Around midnight, however, my rear end began to spew fire and flame. Due to the strong smell, I soon gave myself away and was thrown out by the others. Although it was only midnight, I took the road to Marienburg, where I arrived on January 13, 1813. I had walked the entire way with dirty, frozen, and stinking trousers. Thirst, caused by the constant diarrhea, had tormented me continuously. I had always slept in barns or sheds because I dared not enter any houses, for fear of being thrown out again, as in Elbing. In Marienburg, I spent the night under a shelter on the stones. The next day, I planned to take the road to Danzig, but as I walked over the bridge over the river, I saw several Cossacks coming towards Marienburg. Immediately, 6 or 7 of them rode ahead. When they reached me, one of them nearly ran his lance or pike through my buttock. Then they dismounted and robbed me of a gold and silver pocket watch and 18 gold Napoleons that I had sewn into the collar of my vest. The watch and the gold coins I had found somewhere. The Cossacks took me to the city, where they made many more prisoners of war. This concludes the 10th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. What do you think of Abbeel's adventures? Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.